Hello and welcome everyone to this lesson that we're going to be covering today within the cycle of training that make up the developer program. We're going to be looking at the implementation of screen-based rules. And we have within the course, we have something of an introduction to the topic, plus setting the scene for or covering not only the core elements of one part of defining rules, but also setting the scene for other lessons a little bit later on within the cycle of training. We've got to deal with three broad areas within inside this course, two of which I explicitly teach and one of which is implicit within everything that we do. The first that we need to look at is the different types of rules that exist within Sage CRM. We've touched on rules already, and when we were looking at the idea of the data model, we'll be carrying some of these ideas of integrity and the different forms of business rules into our discussion of how we approach the way in which we define rules and the alternatives that Sage CRM gives us. We'll also be looking at the actual process of defining a type of business rule known as a create script. This is one of the scripting locations that we talked about in yesterday's lesson. And all the way through, we'll look at some general tips about how we approach and the challenges of writing the JavaScript inside the API. So here we are, that's the broad outline. So let's start, not surprisingly, at the beginning, and for a course that is highly practical, let's actually go in and look at the product. I'm going to log on in CRM. What I want to do is to think about the different types of rules that exist. Now, we have been talking about business rules already when we've been looking at the earlier lessons. First of all, we talked about the database needing to be able to implement three forms and types of integrity within inside the system. And I described those integrities as being basically, first of all, key integrity. And let's actually look at a better one than this. For example, if we go and search for companies inside the system and look at this, key integrity means that as we look at any data within the system, the one field that we can be guaranteed as far as the database is concerned that will be not null and will be unique will be the primary key. So there is no record within the system that actually shares the same primary key. Everyone will get a different primary key. There's the primary key of this particular company shown inside the URL. That's primary key integrity, but there's also the idea of referential integrity. So whereas we look at something like a case, a customer care issue, and we have a look at that, we can see where there's referential relationships or relationships between a child and a parent. Referential integrity talks about how the child cannot be a child of a parent that doesn't exist. So this idea of a lookup field that enforces so that when we're looking up into a record that actually is there. And we can see that Sage CRM actually implements this referential integrity through the way in which the fields add value into the interface. So this nature of lookup, it could have been just a plain text field, but of course we have a lookup here, which means that we can only look up to existing values. And that's referential integrity, but we've seen that the fields are the things that add value and provide that. And here we come on to the third form of integrity that databases usually worry about, which is the idea of allowed values, the mandatory nature of the field, the ranges that you can set in. And at this point, what we see is that again it's the field types which are responsible for providing the integrity of the data. Now you can see here this is an example of a field that is marked with a little asterisk by the side, which is the visual clue that if we try and save this, this is a required field, and so it must have data in this field in order to allow for the commit to take place. And where we are forcing behavior within the interface, and this is another example of forcing behavior within the interface, we are implementing a constraint to say that the only data allowed here are these values, or you must provide a value. This is what we can call a restriction placed on the user. And just as we found as we leave a field blank and we choose save, we get a visual prompt. This is coupled with the idea of some form of information to the user. Now, in fact, information rules are just about anything that we see written out into the interface. The captions of the fields are informational to the user. They're adding to this user experience, and so they can be thought of as business rules themselves of the type informative or presentational rules. And here you can see as well a message that explains how this particular screen is to be used is an example of an information rule. But that's not really what we're aiming for in this particular lesson. When we think about terms of restriction and informative, they're usually coupled together with the idea that there should be some sort of blocking action and there should be a message that explains why. Now, much of the restrictions that we find within the system are implicit. They are things that we have chosen to be able to do by adding in the correct metadata definitions to control the interface. But there are areas in which we would see there being a restriction that is explicit. And actually in this area, if we click on change, there's an area in which the restrictive rules come in and show that in fact we are blocked from committing data if we miss some information out. So here you can see SLA severity. There's implicit behavior as to which options are available. If I choose save now, you can see that there is a message that comes up. There's the information element and the prompt to indicate where the rule triggers. So we have information here, but actually this is a defined script. It's not something that is implicitly done. It is defined as something called a validation script. And if I was to choose to leave this field blank as well, the SLA, and choose save, what we're seeing there is that we can express rules that are able to reference other rules, and in order to work out whether the total picture of the data is valid or not. And now that's a type of restrictive rule that blocks the user for doing something, and ultimately it's about blocking the commit process so the data doesn't go in. And in fact, most business rules are all about ensuring the integrity of the data. And if I go into the administration screens, we can see that this particular rule is written inside the cases screen, inside case detail. So you can see here I've navigated to administration, customization cases, and now as I look at the case detail box, we can see in the field SLA severity. If I look down in here, we can see that there is in fact a validate script that is available to us. And this is very good, and what we can then do, we can then go into leave that and start thinking about other areas in which different types of rules are expressed. The next type of behavior, if we've looked at the idea of restriction blocks us, there are types of rules which allow us to change behavior or change data to bring it within tolerance, because after all, some data may actually be broadly okay, it's just formatted wrongly, or it needs to be spaced out in a different way. An example of this is something that we saw in yesterday's lesson again when we were looking at addresses. This is an example, as I look at an address and think about the idea of a postcode. If I was to write the postcode in lowercase and tab off, and you see it's moved into uppercase, this is an example of a rule that is corrective in its nature. Now, the interesting thing that we see here is that it is what we see here is that it is invisible to the user. Unless the user is aware, like they've been looking at the postcode, they wouldn't have been aware that the postcode has been capitalized. And so the job here is very much of a corrective rule is typically to make amends without necessarily any information being added or explicitly brought to the attention of the user. And we will see that a lot of these types of corrective rules take place inside client-based coding. So if I look again to the administration screens for this, so if I go back into administration and look this time at the address field, we know where this is because we were looking at it yesterday by going into administration, customization, address, and then down into the screens, and then down into the address box long, and we can see there's our address postcode. And so this is an example of something that is implemented within the interface. They can be quite interesting in terms of changing and correcting information, because this is correcting the information in a single field. If I look as a user, so if I log on here as a user like Susan May, what we'll find is that the behavior doesn't necessarily have to correct information in its own field. It can correct information in other fields, and again, it can do it quietly without necessarily informing the user. And if I go to let's not do that, let's actually create a new company, and here I'm going to create a new company, and what I need you to do, and this is going to be a little bit tricky to look at, if I just expand out the screen to full screen, and I'm also going to change the fonts to try and bring as much information onto the field as possible. What I'm interested in doing is drawing your attention to the field up here, which is the security territory field for the company, and down here we can see that there's a security territory field for the person. If I change this value to US and Canada, you'll see that it has changed to US and Canada. US and Canada. It will also have changed down here when we look at the information for the person. So here this took place automatically without me having to be aware that that sort of change as a user took place. So corrective rules don't necessarily have to have any overt notification of the user, but its job is to change data so that it's within tolerance, and if you're working with an informative rule, it might explain why the change has taken place. There's a third type of rule that is something that is a little bit more tricky to explain inside the default demo system, but is perfectly understandable as to what it's about. And this is where you could have a rule that is triggered automatically by actions to cascade a change throughout the system. And the point about this is that it is an automatic manipulation of the data without the user necessarily having any visual clue that this is something that has taken place. So if I return back just into the normal display of the information, and this time run across to a company like Gatecom, an example of such a rule might be as if I click change to reassign the company to a new account manager. A manipulative rule won't necessarily make any alteration or notification to the interface, but what it would do was simply automatically change the information in the background. So it would perhaps reassign the open opportunities for this company so that they are now assigned to the new account manager for the company. And an alternative explanation or understanding can be also provided by escalation rules. Here you can see that the system administrator has got a lot of notifications telling them that rules have or new high-value opportunities have been created. Now you can see that the job of these escalation rules are to create automatically notifications onto the screen when the data is in a particular state. But equally, when we come on to look at escalation rules inside the interface, we'll discover that we can create escalation rules that look at the state of the data, and if the data is in a particular state, it can carry out an action, and one of those actions can be actually to change data or to run an SQL statement that can cascade a change throughout the system. So manipulative rules are rules which take place in the background without actually the user being aware that those are being triggered by the actions and the path that the user leaves throughout the system. So those are the different types of rules. So let's take that and start to explore how they're implemented within Sage CRM. Now, as a reminder, before we start doing coding in a particular area, let's just remind ourselves of what we had seen in the lesson yesterday. We had discussed the idea of JavaScript being the same core language throughout, and we use JavaScript all the way through the code that we write, everything from working with working with ASP pages, to working with entity level scripts, to working with things like the advanced mail manager. Now, I used the analogy yesterday about how you can have somebody who uses English as their standard language and they find themselves going into different classrooms within school, and within a history lesson there will be one set of vocabulary that is distinct for the history lesson. So terms like constitutions, battles, kings, queens, and the concept of succession will be discussed there. And then the next day they have to go into another classroom, or later on in the same day they have to go into another classroom which is discussing biology, and there they'll hear completely new words. They'll hear RNA, DNA, they'll discuss speciation, and they'll also discuss things like succession, but it will mean different things to those students in different contexts. Same words, slightly different meaning, slightly different usage. And what we find is that there are different vocabularies that we use as we go through, and this is true whether we are dealing with validate scripts or from create scripts. There are subtle differences in the vocabulary that we use and subtle differences in the behavior of the objects within JavaScript that are referenced as well. Having said that, let's get going and start looking at create script. Create script is the behavior within Sage CRM that allows us to inject behavior within inside the screen as it loads. And to do this, to understand what it is, we can go in and start adding in some behavior for ourselves. And it's a very easy way of starting to understand and learning about what's going on. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to come into the company box long, which is the main screen for the company summary screen. And I've got 4 fields here: company type, company name, company type, SLA, and website. Now the reason for choosing those is if we look at the summary screen, those are the first 4 fields that appear in the screen. Now if I am going to enter in some script here, I need to introduce you to a few words or a few phrases. Now we're going to first of all meet two system variables, one called valid and one called error string. Now valid is a Boolean. It's an internal variable within Sage CRM, and it acts as a flag. So if it finds that the valid flag variable is set to be false, so as though an error has occurred, and here we're using a trick to deliberately raise an error, we can now use the error string, which is the internal string to allow an error message to be contained or held, to actually write out the name of the field. So here I'm just going to write out comp name. Now what I'll do is I will take this and I will use this for each of those fields in turn. So that was comp type, comp SLA ID, and comp website. Whoops, and that's something I need to put back in here. So if I pick these up and I drop those into my create script, I have to update each time I'm checking the change. I'm putting this in, and I'm putting them in order. Each field has its own script. That itself is starting to tell us something, because it must be raising the question of why haven't I just got one script that is affecting the behavior of each or all of these 4 fields. And we'll see that this is the idea of the scope of effect. Scope of reference and scope of effect are 2 important concepts within any of the scripting that we do within Sage CRM. What can you refer to and reference, and what can you change and control? And if I look now at my company screen as a user, you can see that the fields are fired, and you can see here that they're fired in the order in which they're included within the screen. So company name, type, SLA ID, and website. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if we right mouse click and we view the page source, and I go and have a look at comp name, you can see we come down to where we've got the error content being written out. One of the things that we can see is that the code is not written out. So we don't see valid, false, error string. What we see written out is just those 4 error messages. So the content of the variable error string is written out 4 times as each individual field fires, and so the message is built up. Now that tells us that the code has executed inside the EWare-DLL. It's fired inside the server. So that's where it's taking place. And we see that it's fired in the order of 1, 2, 3, 4, fired in the order of company name, company type, company SLA, and company web service. So the order in which those fields were included within the screen is the order of firing. Now it doesn't matter about whether the screen is referenced by a system action. So look at the system action here. If I click change and the system action changes to action 201, it's a different system action, but it's the same screen that's involved, and the fields are fired again. And so you can see bang, 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 bang. This code is executed in this order because the screen has been included. Now these are dealing with validation and error strings, and we've looked at the idea of rules that are restrictive in their nature. One of the things that we can see about the create scripts is that they have limited capacity to restrict action, because if I now choose save, what you can see is that there has been nothing, even though valid has been set to be false, there has been no interruption in the commit process. So create scripts do not interrupt the commit process, and so they can't be thought of as another way of dealing like validation rules. So create rules don't block the submit of data and the commit of data. Now, as we go through, we'll look now more at the concept of reference, what we can reference and what we can control. But we have seen in this is that the create scripts are fired in the server to change the HTML that is delivered into the browser. And that's going to be an important idea for us in a little bit, because we can use this for our own purposes for manipulating the information that is delivered into the interface. So within a traditional install, create scripts are used largely to allow us to control the HTML that is delivered, and so change the presentational constructs within the screens. We can also do some limited restrictive rules by changing the information that is presented to the user as well. So there can be some restriction in this by controlling the presentational information. Now I've done that. There's two lines that I wrote, so valid equals false and error string equals something else. Doesn't look like a particularly convincing program, but that was written in JavaScript. So JavaScript is used for all of the internal scripting within Sage CRM, whether that's create or validate or table level script. And the same core JavaScript objects are used, so the core JavaScript objects are used. We can find the same ability to use the syntax within inside create scripts, but create scripts are much more constrained as to what objects you can use. You'll only find that create scripts can use the core EWare DLL generated objects. These are what are called the CRM objects, plus you can instantiate ActiveX objects, so you could use and access the file scripting object if necessary. Now where it becomes very useful to us is that we can start to explore the idea of context within Sage CRM. Now, I already took you into looking at the idea of the URL. So if I'm looking at my company, let's actually look at the URL that we start with. And what does it tell us? So here, let's see if we can magnify this and get a little bit of a better value for you. Here, if we look at this, we can see we know some information already. We know what the session ID, so that tells us we know automatically what user we've got. We know as well that there is contextual information provided within this string. These are the key variables that are used. Sage CRM is an example of a web-based system is stateless. The state is maintained by the app by the request that the client makes, and this is the state of where we are. And we can see that we're using key 0 equals 1, which tells us that the dominant key is the company. Key 1 is 28, so I know we're dealing with company 28, and key 2 is dealing with person 30. All in all, that means that we're looking at the company, Gatecom, and the person, Simon Yaltoy. So if we run down the bottom, there is Simon Yaltoy as person 30. But if I now decide to go to an individual opportunity within this, and we can see here I'm now looking at an individual opportunity, we can see that there's been a change to the information within inside the screen. So if I just close up some of the gaps and paste this in, we can start to see that we still obviously have our session ID. We also have the same type of information here. We've got key 0 is still 1, still dominant key is the company, still looking at our company 28, person 30, but we've been joined by another key item of information, which is the opportunity information. And just so that there's no ill feeling, it actually emphasizes that again by saying the opportunity ID is 6. So we've got more contextual information available to us. And this builds again in richness. If I now look at communications that are associated with this and look at an individual record of a conversation. So if I produce that and write that into my Scratchpad editor, and I look at the fact that we've got the session ID in here, still knowing which user we're using, but we also now have some other contextual information, like the key -1 indicates where were we last, what was the previous context. Key 0 is now 7, so we're in the context of the opportunity. We still have the information about the company, we still have the person information, but now we have, in addition to the opportunity number 6, we also have the communication 94. So we've got more and more information building as we go through the system using the URL. And Sage CRM provides us within the API mechanism to reference all of these. So this is the idea of what is our scope of reference. I can reference anything that is in context, anything that is provided by the URL. And the most important point of reference is which user is logged on, which user is doing this work, and that's provided by the idea of the current user property. And in my code, I can start to change this. I can look at an example here and now say valid is false, and what I'll do is I'll just write out instead of instead of writing out simply a string, I'm going to write out current user display name, and I will write out who this person is who's accessing my screen. So we've got currently the company name. I'm going to put in here the display name, and I'm going to get rid of these other items in here. So we only have a nice simple one single message being written out. If we need to, I can put those back in as well. But there we are. We've cleared that out. Choose save. and as soon as that's happened, I can jump back to my company. So I jump back to my company, and what we can see is it's written out. It knows that it's Susan May who's accessing the screen, and that's very good. It knows who has logged on. And this is the you can see within the current user object there's a whole set of different properties that we can reference. We can reference which department that we're in, which rights do we have over reports. There's a lot of information that's contained in here that can be used to influence what is presented to the user. Now, this is not the only type of information that is available. Because we've got all of this contextual information available, we've got a mechanism within CRM called get context info, and it's a very efficient little method. So what I can do is I can say, well, let's write something here which will tell us where we are. So I am going to say valid equals false, and I'm going to write out my error string. But here I'm going to put this into a case screen, and I'm going to show that I can reference and find out which company I'm accessing or working in, and I can also see which person is using the system, which person the case is being assigned to. So here I'm going to say crm.getContext info, and what I want to do in here is reference the entity, which I want is the company, and then the next the field that I'm interested in. So I'll get comp underscore name. So that will return a string. Get context does return a string, so that's fine. I don't need to convert it into a number or anything, but let's go into choosing that. And what I'll do is I'll now go ahead as a system administrator and go and look at the cases area, and I'll add in a little proof that I know what I'm doing. And as in I know where I am, not that I know what I'm doing, but where the user is. So here in our case reference ID, I can put in my create script, I can update that, choose save, and once that's saved inside the screen, I can go and reference it. So if I look now at a case, and I think a good thing to do is to go and look at a company like Eurolandia. If I look for Eurolandia, go in here, we can see that there's a variety of different cases underneath here. If I select this, it's going to tell me it knows that this case is for Eurolandia. Well, that doesn't look terribly impressive, but we can start to develop this idea a little bit further. Because we can reference information from the parental company, we can start to warn users if some information is missing. So here we have an idea that in fact I can now reference with the get context info and look at the service level agreement, check to see whether it's defined within the company, and then warn the user whether that needs to be taken into account. So I can start my little bit of code. I can say var let's see, my field, and then write out the check for the SLA ID, and let's change this to my SLA, and here I can do a bit of a logical check to say if my SLA, SLA, and what we're checking for is, do we have it? So if we don't have a service level agreement, then we can take action. So in here, the action that I want to be able to take is to warn the user. So I will say valid is false, and in here I will express this as a message and say the SLA, the company SLA is not defined. So that's a warning to the user. So here, if I go and paste this, the choice is which field am I doing this on. So am I going to do it on this field, the case SLA? Don't need to do it. I'm not affecting anything in here. I'm only referencing needing a place to reference the parental information, and so I'm going to put it onto this field, even though the message is not really associated with the case reference ID. We're just using this as the vehicle in which to put the code. And I can now update this and choose save. And I switch around into my user, and I look at a case. Let's go to the company and start the process of creating a new case. And cases and creating, oh, I can't, I'll have to do this as another user, Kylie Ward, somebody who has the rights to be able to do this. So if I log on, go off and find the company Eurolandia, so I'm dealing with the same company. So there's Eurolandia. We can see that I'm logged on as a different user now, Kylie Ward. If I come on to cases, you can see I've got a new case button that if I click on new case, we can see the company SLA is not defined. And is that actually true? When we're looking at Eurolandia and looking at here, we can see, yes, indeed, the service level agreement is not defined. So that's an example of the type of rule that we can implement. Now, this has a number of important problems with it, doing it this way. If I look at my new case and we see the message that is expressed here, that's one thing, but the message has been hard coded. I've written the text, the company SLA is not defined, and so if I have multiple users, different languages, then I would have to take that into account. What I also have to take into account is that as I fill in the information here, this is not actually going to interrupt me when I come to commit the data. So I choose save. This has not actually blocked that action, so they're not restrictive. So if this was a genuine blocking rule, I'd also have had to implement it in another way. So for example, I'd have had to have backed it up with a validation rule. But let's see about this idea of the idea of translation, so we can make this a little bit more neater as a rule. If I go in as the system administrator and go up to customization and think about translations, Oh, that managed to get in my way. Get into translations, and if we look, there's a family called errors. So we can see all these different errors that exist within the system. There isn't an error. I was looking earlier on, there isn't an error that I can use, so I'm going to create a brand new error. Here I'm going to call this SLA company SLA, and I need to put it into the errors caption family, and I need to put that with the caption family type of tags, and so I can paste in my translation. So I'll put in all the different languages that I know my system is using. So I choose save. There's the information defined, and I can now go to my go back to my code and change this. The way in which I change it is to use crm.getTrans, which is one of the mechanisms. So getTrans, and in here what we have to enter is the caption family and the caption code. The caption family was errors, and the caption code was company SLA. So company SLA, and that's entered in here, and I can now to use that revised version of my code. So if I return into administration, into come out of the customization translations area, and instead go into customizations and come down into where I was working with the cases, and then inside the screen and inside the case detail box we've got our little bit of code defined here. I'm just going to replace that and paste that in, and you can see now I'm not directly writing the message out. I'm using getTrans, which is a better way of doing this. Now, even this is getting better, getting good. I would still have to back this up with a validation script, because on its own we've seen that create scripts do not block actions. We also can come across the fact that this rule where we are working with a company, working with the idea of creating a new case, this type of behavior, and it's working exactly the same as whereas it was. The message is just coming from the translation now, not hard-coded, but this actual behavior could be implemented using the client-side API as well in version 7.2 and 7.3. It can be actually in some ways a little bit more sophisticated than the create script, because the client-side API gives us ways in which we can not only provide a warning, but we can also remove the save button from screen. So there it starts to get close to the idea of a full restriction in its behavior. But we do need create scripts in some areas, and we're going to start looking at how we've got a variety of different properties that we can use. One of these properties is the remove lookup. It's a very neat trick to be able to say, well, if the information is in this way, we can actually remove options from within inside the drop-down list. So I could remove any of these options if I didn't want it, or areas like this. And you can see that it is just as simple as going into the case detail area and if we're looking at the area that we've got here, case area, we could use a create script to control the availability of a particular option in the list. The option here, remove lookup, is one of the options that are designed for this particular type of control within inside CRM. So if I go and remove lookup training, choose update, choose save, and when that's saved, I'll be able to do this. If I cancel now and choose new case again, as we look in the area, what we'll see is that training has disappeared. And we could see that we could choose to remove options to shape the choices that a user can make. Of course, this is actually again controlling and making a, if you like, a restriction on the user. And we can extend this. There are other properties within the list, as you can see here. There's the way in which we can set default values, and we can change the properties of the field. If you don't like the idea of remove lookup as quite a long-winded way of changing the options inside a list, it is also possible to swap in completely a new translation family that is used for in order to provide a different set of options for that particular field. So you can look and say, well, if you're this type of company, and you're creating a case, these are the options that you see. If you're that type of company, these are the options that you'll see. You can provide alternative sets of translations for the drop down, and there is an option on the caption family. Do have a look at the blog articles that support this, because that's discussed in some of the roundup articles that explain how to control fields within the interface using create scripts. One of the options that I should point out to you as well is the idea of hiding a field or changing a field to read only. What if we have a field in here, which we do, like SLA? Now I'll actually jump back into the level of the company for this. So if I jump to here and consider this SLA field, what if I wanted to say only some people should be able to change this? It might be that I would say that only people, for example, that are in the support team should be able to change and access the SLA ID field. Now this can be expressed in code. We know about context, we know about the user, and we know that we can say if something like this, current user dot user underscore primary channel ID is equivalent to 3, then what we will do is we will, or let's see, not equal to 3. Let's hide it, so we can say that this is read only is true. So here we're saying that if you're not in the correct team, it's read only, this field. That's so simple. I can go into here and into my company, and I can look at my screen, and it looks like it's a really neat level of code that I can put in here. But there is a problem with it. I'll explain what the problem is in a moment. There's my SLA company ID field, I choose update, I choose save. It does work, so it's not a problem in the operation. Once we've saved this, we will see that it's a little bit more sophisticated than this, the idea of the problem, because if I click on my company and I now click change, what you'll find as somebody like Susan May, who's in the team 1, in channel 1, this is the direct support team, can't change that field. And if Kylie Ward comes into the same field and clicks change, you can see that they it's currently being edited. There we are. Look at that. That's quite good. That's a record is currently being edited by Susan May. Hello everyone. This is now a lesson about locking within Sage CRM. Let's actually cancel that from Kylie May, from Susan May, so that Kylie Ward can edit this. If I click on change, we can see that in fact Kylie Ward can now edit that field. Now that looks pretty good, but I think it's rubbish, because actually I need to go in here and I need to look at, well, all the code that we've written so far, and I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to come down to the SLA code and I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to get rid of that. I don't want that, because I don't need to use code in order to implement that in order to implement that rule. I can come to the properties of the field and I can get rid of nasty code by just using a metadata definition. So here is my SLA field. You can see it here, and if I click on this field level security option at this point, I can choose to add a new policy to say that the team that is customer service should be able to have write access, whereas nobody else should have write access. So everyone is denied access, only customer service is given access. So if I continue there, we say exactly the same rule has been implemented. So here we can see that my locking is in place. We can see that if I click on change, my user cannot access the service level agreement field. Let's cancel that, and over here we can see that my user who is in the correct team can actually access that. So this is all to do with just inbuilt simple metadata changes without any code being able to implement that rule. But hang on, Jeff, what about looking at what we have got here? And what we'll find is when we look at this SLA, we can only reference information about the person. We cannot look at any information about the underlying data. So the trouble with field level security is that it is only aware of the user. It is not aware of anything else. Its scope of reference is very, very narrow, whereas the create script scope of reference is anything that it can see, anything in context, and actually anything in the database. So it knows all about the user, it knows all about the data in context, and actually it can then go and search for information in the database as well, if necessary. And so we can say, well, that's a rubbish rule, I can get rid of that rule, I can allow that access and continue, because what I want to consider now is the idea of a rule that looks at both the user's team plus also the status of the company. So if I take that original rule that I defined and add a little bit more to this, what I'm going to do is say var company type, comp type is equal to crm.getContextInfo, and what we're looking at is company and then comp type, and we just need to do a double check to say that our comp type is equal to, equivalent to, I have to be very careful here, is equivalent to customer. So what I've entered now into my clause is two logical checks. One could be done by the no-code metadata approach, but in order to reference information about the current context of the entity that we're looking at, we would have to use the create script in order to implement the rule. So now I can go into my screen, I can go into my company box long, and on my SLA I can then look to add that. So it's going to make sure that we're of the type company, in order to allow the change to take place. So click change. We can see that that record is being edited by Kylie Ward. I think it's going to be very interesting on the recording about that, but there we are. We can see that we're not in the right team, but it is a customer, so we can understand that. Here, if we click change, I'm in the right team and it is a customer, so we can change it. So those conditions are both correct, so that's why Kylie Ward can change it. If I change this to being a prospect and choose save, and now click change again, you can see that's something's not quite right within my logic. What's right at my logic? So we're not in team ours. Okay, does not equal. So that's the correcting that logic. So and again, this becomes one of our battles for making sure that we get the logic correct for the rule that we're trying to express. Okay, so we've shown that we can now try and force people to be in a particular team, in a particular state of company, in order to allow for the data to be edited, and that's the sort of thing that we have to do with the create script. And we can reference a very wide range of information. We've started to see that we can go into the database with the get context info, but in fact we can also see information that is not in the database but is being passed to the system as well. And this is introducing the idea of the values and form values collections. They're not really collections, they're really methods, but people call them collections. So the values collections, form values, these methods allow us to see into and reference information that is within the browser being submitted either within the form or within the query string. We'll be meeting form values later on in our discussions. Right now I'm only using the values mechanism, and this is because it gives us access to the query string. What's so great about the query string? Well, it gives us access to all of this rich stuff, including, of course, information about the action key and the mode, and this can be a huge prompt when we're starting to think about mode within a screen. Now please be aware that the word mode within the URL doesn't necessarily mean anything to do whether the page is in view mode as we are here, or when we switch over into edit mode, or whether we choose to switch over into save mode. So mode is in the URL is not actually referring to what we would normally consider to be screen mode. It is referring instead as a flag, as an additional parameter to the main system action. It's really a developer's trick, but because it's something that our own internal developers use, we can observe it and we can use it as a phenomenon to allow us to understand when a screen is in a particular condition. How could we tell whether we are in, just as we can see here looking at Eurolandia, whether we are looking at the view mode, or whether we're looking at edit mode, or whether we're looking at post-save mode? This is a trick that we can see here. Valid equals false, error string is going to be equal to, and what I'll say here is act is vals act plus, and what I'll write out here is so I've just written a little bit of code here which will report back that to tell which mode we're dealing with, and make sure there's no confusion that it does find the right item. So if I switch back into my code here and I put this into my company name field, again I'm only using this as a vehicle. I'm going to get rid of the other code inside here because I don't want to have any conflicts or messing up. I just want to work with the simple one that we've got at any one time. There I save the screen. And once that's saved, I'm going to go as Simon Yaltoy, as my user Susan May, and jump across back to Gatecom as my company. And what we can see is that the action code that I've used is 520 and the mode is 1. Well, there you go, action code 520 and the mode is 1. Now what happens if I click on the summary page? So if I come back into the main summary page, we can see the action code is 200 and the mode is 1. So there's the action code 200 and the mode is 1. Now what happens if I click change, and you can see that we're in a different action code. It's action code 201 with mode 1, and if I just save this, we can see it's action code 201 mode 3. So this tells us if it's in that particular context of where the action code is 201 with mode 3, we can tell that we've ended up on a screen that is just after saving the company. We can use this, by the way, use this sort of trick in all sorts of circumstances. For example, wouldn't it be pretty clever to be able to say, as soon as I've entered an opportunity, I want to redirect to a particular screen. As soon as I've entered a note, I want to go back to a particular screen. Well, you can use the idea of the mode checking to see how all this changes, to be able to work out where you are and where you need to be sent to. So it's a extremely useful trick to establish the exact circumstances. Now, the types of tricks that we can use and develop on this, and by the way, that idea of have I just saved something, do I need to redirect, is relying on the idea that actually what we can do is reference properties of a field like caption. We saw the property of the remove lookup, the method remove lookup, but actually inside a field like the company, inside the company box long where I've got my company name, if I get rid of that and put instead caption equals wibble, and let's show that I can put in here, I can actually put in some JavaScript, or sorry, not JavaScript, into HTML. If I write out marquee, please bear in mind that marquee is a tag that is very deprecated. It won't work in Internet Explorer, but it does work in Chrome, and it's therefore quite funny. If I save that and now go to my company summary page, we can see that I've got some information rolling across the screen. I don't actually advise you that this is a good way of displaying information to our users, but it is nevertheless fun to do occasionally. But this caption trick shows that we can add in HTML into the interface. If we can add in HTML into the interface, we can add all sorts of things in and extend the interface in all sorts of ways. So if I update that and choose save, the trick that I'm going to use is one now that makes use of a dummy field. A dummy field is a field that is added into the physical structure of the CRM database, not for any data storage purpose, but simply to give us the actual structure of all of the metadata that we can use to take advantage of this. Now, please bear in mind that is not, because I'm not going to be altering the underlying view and just creating a derived field. I actually want a stub field that will never hold data. So I'm going to create a new bit of information here called dummy. You can see that I've done this before. I'll call it dummy as well. And I'll change its length so it's 1. So minimum sizing, and choose save. Once that's done, I'll double check that this is doing nothing, no data will be entered into it, by changing where I've got the dummy field into simply being no one can write anything into it, to remove access to that field. So I'll continue there. So it's an actual definite, you are denied access to that field to edit. So everyone can see it. Now everyone can see it because I know that everyone can see it, because I can come to the top content screen, and the top content is used to allow us to extend the information that is displayed at the top part of the screen. And if I look through here, I can find my dummy field somewhere in here. There we are, dummy, and I can add that in and choose save. And if I jump across to another company like Eurolandia, we can see that dummy is displayed at the top of the screen. It's displayed, there we are, just like a field inside the system. And this is where we can say, haha, now that that's a real field, now that we've got this field inside here, I can go and do all sorts of clever stuff and say caption equals this is anything I like. So we add that in, and that will go now as the caption into the interface. And just as we used before, the idea that we could add in HTML, we can use the fact that the scope of reference for a create script is anything in the database, anything that's in context, anything that it can then use to retrieve information that can build additional useful information here inside the system. Now, wouldn't it be nice, as we're looking at Eurolandia, to know how many opportunities and how many cases this particular company has just as you come into here? Why do we actually have to go into opportunities to tell how many opportunities and how many cases we have? Of course, this is the type of information that can be displayed inside the dashboard, but we still have to click on the dashboard tab to get that information. Wouldn't it be great if we just saw a total just there? And by extension, by the way, we could even use this idea and say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could look into a linked database where the ERP or the accounting information is held and have that displayed within the context of my company? And it doesn't have to be through a database lookup. It could be through a web service lookup, perhaps. And this is where we can become very, very clever. I'm going to use a little bit of code. Here I'll look at some code that I've written earlier and look at my code that we've got. I'm going to put this into my editor here, and we can see that it's not actually as horrendous as you might have thought. The first thing that we see here is the idea of us creating a record object that is the result of this method, crm.findRecord. crm.findRecord allows us to look, essentially issuing a select statement against from the opportunity where, and here you can see that we've built a clause where the opportunity is in progress and where the opportunity primary company ID is equal to, and here we meet something that we've met before, the idea of the company ID. So we are assembling here the where clause. And by the way, you can notice as well that we are nesting a string inside a string in order to pass that into the database. So there's the method that is used to go and find additional information using the contextual information to pull back the question of how many opportunities have we got. We do the same with the cases table, and by extension we could do it for quotes, orders, custom entities or external references as well. And you can see that we're starting to assemble the caption. Notice that we're using one of the assignment operators that we looked at in yesterday's, where we are basically doing an additive concatenation. We are basically saying add this to itself plus this. So we keep adding and adding and adding, concatenating the previous value of this field to this field. And you can see that we're using getTrans to make sure that we get hold of the correct caption for this field. Now, one of the things that we haven't met before is this idea of the crm.url, and then there's a number in there. Well, This is perhaps a little easier for you to understand because actually you know that if you look at opportunities, we're using the action code 184, and if we look at cases, we're using the action code 185. These are the internal references for that, and by using the method crm.url, we are building the correct path with all of the existing contextual information that we're used to seeing, or we were used to when we were looking at earlier on. So it maintains context but changes the action to look at the company's opportunities and then the company's cases as well. And we can see that we use the record count property of the returned record object to allow us to provide the information to the user, and so on. We keep writing the HTML, and so that's fully built. So I'll pick this up and I can now paste that into my company top content, and I get rid of the example that I had before. I update it, I save it, and now when I look at this, if I look at my summary, we can see it tells me that we've got 3 opportunities and 5 cases for the company Eurolandia. So I can click on that and there you go. We've got 3 and we've got 5. So it's telling us correctly the information that is in progress. So that's the idea of that particular trick, and this concept of doing work like this isn't, you don't need to use the create script, however, to do that. All this behavior, looking into the database, finding data, can be could actually be done by the client-side API AJAX mechanism. So that's a very simple way to retrieve information. Even getting hold of the correct translations and building the correct URL paths, all can be done by using methods within the client-side API. And there is an advantage to consider to doing it in the client-side API, and this is something that in the next lesson we will be developing. But as we look here into our screens, the thing to bear in mind is the maintenance load of needing to know where each of the create scripts are held and how to stop well-meaning system administrators accidentally editing the code and so breaking the code. It can be very easy to break scripts which are held inside the create script. But having said that, you know, there are plenty of funky things that we can do with this. This, for a long time, was the principal mechanism by which we could change and create essentially our own field types inside CRM. Here you can see I've introduced a new image field type, which shows a considerably younger Jeff Richards inside the screen. Goodness, that's too young for anyone, and that is the idea of using the caption trick again to reference the documents and to pick up an image that is stored in the documents and then translating that into a path that is rendered within the interface. And we started to discuss sorts of things like this within the code within the lesson yesterday, and in fact this is a nice and sophisticated example. It's probably too sophisticated to deal in detail here. We just don't have so much time to do that, but if you want to take a nice leisurely look at this, if you go to the community and you go into the partner area and you come down into where we have got the downloads, And within the downloads, you come down to the developer downloads and components. Here you will find that there is a option to display an image on the person summary screen. So if I take this and I download this component, so that's going to be called person image 3. Back here as the system administrator, if I go to customization, I can go to my component manager. I can then go and look to choose that particular file. That will be down in the downloads, and within downloads, if I say person image 7.3 and upload that, I can see display image in person summary, and then I can choose to install the component, and it will do a number of different jobs. It will, for example, create a new library type of image, and it will add, of course, the dummy field and the associated code into the person screens. So I will install this component now. That runs very nicely. You can continue, and if we jump across here as Susan May, I go up to my company Eurolandia. Let's go into one of the people within Eurolandia. Let's go to Gareth McDade, and what we see is that there's a field in here called no image available. The way in which it works is that we can go and choose a document. I can choose to add a file. I need to go and find a nice image. So let's go into Dropbox. Let's have a look at some camera, my pictures, and have a look at this. This should be me. So if I choose to say that this is an image and choose save, we can now go back to look at the summary, and we can see there is that particular image again associated with the user. That's with the person. So we've now got a field that is edited in one way but is displayed in another. So we could use this for a whole variety of different purposes. And if we look at what's being done, the chief thing that is interesting about this is the building of the path to make sure that we see the path that would normally be the path that is accessed here. If I click on the attachment there, that pops up the document. Okay, so it's basically building that path so it's all correct. Okay, so that's the idea of the way in which we create our script for the image field as one of the tricks that we can do. But it's not quite the last word about the use of create scripts and how they're done. We've seen the idea of create scripts, but again, in another sort of classroom, we can also use this idea of create scripting, but we use a slightly different vocabulary as well. Here, if I look at my opportunities while I'm in a company, it doesn't make sense necessarily to display the company name, because after all, I know that we are in the company Eurolandia, even if we're in the main context of a person. But when we're looking at the opportunities here when we look at let's actually get rid of this CRM4. And we look at our opportunities, we can see here that we've got lots of opportunities, and it makes sense at this point we would see the company name. We can change and customize that opportunity list to selectively hide the field. And there are other properties that we can change, but basically if we look at the opportunity list, we can control the grid columns that make up the list by changing properties within the create script. We know about getting hold of contextual information. We've seen it here, and we can actually start off with the idea of get context and say, well, here there's our context, and I'm interested in company ID. Well, if we have our ID, then we know we're in the context of the company, and so we can hide it. So if here ID is valid, then what we want to do is to say visible, which is the property visible, is going to be set to be false. And if we have a company ID, we'll hide the information. Now, if you're a little bit more alert than I was when I first sat this course, you'll notice that the columns have a property called visible, and whereas fields or entries have a property called hidden, and they're just the other way around. And this is what I was saying about different contexts have slightly different vocabulary and objects available to us. So I paste that in. If I make sure I was in the correct field for that purpose, yes, the company name, I update it and choose save. We can now go and see whether that's actually still reporting correctly. So if I refresh the screen, we should see, there we are, design right, company name, they're all displayed. If I go into Eurolandia and look at the opportunities, suddenly the company name should not be displayed. It's no longer visible. And this is the sort of thing that we can do, changing the properties of a field. So we might actually add in the ability to sort or remove the caption for a field in particular circumstances as well. So changing sort orders or changing the ability to sort on a field is something that we can do within the level of the individual columns as well. Now, I've covered a lot of ground in this lesson, and I've covered it very, very quickly. I do hope that that has been useful to you. Let's see if anyone here has got any questions.